Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of my lesson on I'm Buzzed by Michael Landau from his seminal album Tales from the Vault. How I want to run this lesson is to talk to you for a moment about sounds, take you through how to actually physically play all the parts, but also use this as an opportunity to shoehorn a little bit of theory stuff in and just talk about my approach to naming and visualizing more complicated chords like this so that you can take it forward into your own playing. So let's make a start. Gear, our collective favorite subject, no doubt. So for this particular track, Mike was using a 1970s Jose modded Marshall head into a 60s Marshall cab with greenbacks, and he would have been using his Floyd Rose equipped Schecter Strat with a humbucker in the bridge at the time. This one ended up being pretty heavily modded by James Tyler, so it may have even had a Tyler pickup in it back then. For that record, Mike was also occasionally running a juice extractor attenuator, but apparently for this one he wasn't. He was just cranking it, and I think you can really hear that in how dynamic the overdrive sound is. Now, as you may have noticed, I am not using any of those things. And for a reason. Part of it is a practical thing, just because I do have my Tyler Strat over there, but it can be a little buzzy under this light, and I'm also using my Kemper kind of for convenience, but also because number one, I've decided to do this lesson in drop D standard rather than half a step down and then drop D, which is what the record is, to make life a little bit easier for those of you with floating sort of trem systems. And the other thing is that I don't want to sort of paint the picture that you can only get these sounds if you have the rack system and the Tyler guitar, because it's not the case. You can get a good bit of the way there with whatever you have, and then I mean really the extra kind of 10% of the sound is that gear, but can still sound pretty good. A few of you asked what I was using on the last video. Obviously I was using my Tyler, but I was actually using the Kemper, and that was purely because that amp there, which is what I normally use, was still at the studio after a session I've been doing, and my beloved Little Wave chorus pedal was actually back with Luca at the time, because I very stupidly dropped the weight of that pedal board onto that and broke it while I was doing some soldering at 3 o'clock in the morning. So Lucas fixed it for me and put a nice Red 7 faceplate on there, which is the only reason why I wasn't using it for that track. Anyway, let's make a start. How I am going to sort of approach the riff is in layers. I'm going to show it you in its most basic form, and then talk to you about the little detail bits which I notice make sound more like Mike. So from a sort of sonics point of view, what you want is sort of quite a touch sensitive kind of overdrive. You'll notice that if I play light, it's pretty clean, and then as you dig in, it will start to sort of break up, and that's kind of the key to this sort of sound really. The profile I'm using is actually a sort of custom Audio Electronics OD100 style profile, which has a similar sort of gain structure. Not perfect. Mike's definitely sounds more alive and a little bit more kind of squishy, which I think you can only get from actually having a really loud tube amp in the room, but this works okay for now. Let's get into the riff. So in its most simplest form, we are just using a handful of shapes. So our kind of opening movement is essentially double stops. So we're starting with the open A and the D. We're then barring the 3rd fret of the same 2 strings, and then moving up to the 5th, and then we turn that double stop into a power chord by adding our little finger to the 7th fret of the D string, so we get. Okay, I'm going to come back in and paint all the detail and the highlights after we've done this, so don't worry. The next couple of chords are these 2 shapes. We have a bar at the lowest 2 strings at the 2nd fret, with our little finger situated at the 5th fret of the D. little finger stays where it is as you move the index finger up a semitone. So we get okay, just bouncing between those two shapes. On the repeat, it opens the same way. And then we see these two new shapes. Now, for these two, we have a bar at the 7th fret, which is going to stretch from the lowest string up to the G. And then we are going to have our little finger on the 10th fret of the D. Okay. For the second chord, we are going to drop to the 5th fret. We're still going to bar the lowest two strings, and then we're going to play the 7th fret of the D and the G. So we get so up to that point, slowly, and this is kind of without some of the detail bits. That's really the bones of it until we get to the sort of descending part where the clean guitar takes over. If you listen to the overdriven part underneath that, it's basically moving these two slash chords kind of down. So for that sequence, we have our chord from earlier, which is basically barring the 7th fret and then grabbing the 10th fret of the D with your little finger. And then we drop down to the 5th fret bar, keep your little finger where it is, and drop down to the 4th fret, which sounds weird when you hold it, but it only happens for a second in the track. And then we basically move that same movement down a tone. So exactly the same kind of progression, just starting on the 3rd fret, going to the 2nd, so we get okay. Now let's talk about how to actually make it sound like Mike. So there's a couple of things I noticed when I was transcribing this. The first is there is a presence of the lower string running all the way through, but it doesn't sound like he's always playing it. It just sounds like it's there as almost like an overtone underneath the other stuff. So the first thing you can do to get it sounding a bit more authentic is, even though you're not playing the low D all the time, you are gonna fret it all the time. So with that intro part of the riff, I'm actually only plucking the A and the D, but I'm holding down the low E, the A and the D. And it does have a contribution. It's very subtle, but it kind of fills out the low end. However, it also doesn't sound right to pick every note. If I'm always picking the low D, sound right either, and if I just play the A and the D, it sounds too thin. However, if I play the A and the D with my fingers and then just fret the low string, it starts to sound more like Mike. So that's the kind of first little detail bit. The second bit are the ghost notes. So there is specific placement of dead notes and also what I'd call ghost notes, which are notes that are sounding, as in they have a sounded pitch, unlike a dead note, which is pitchless, but they are very, very subtle and momentary. And I'm going to show you where they are. So to start off with, we start out with a dead note. The first bit of the riff is not the open string, it's... So you notice there's like that little dead note, which I'm just playing with my thumb to preempt the first sounded part of the chord. Now, we don't have anything else up until there, but then we have a ghost note preceding those two chords, and it's just going to be a little open low E. Obviously it's a low D now, but for the sake of ease. Okay, very, very subtle, and just before we play the fretted note at the 2nd fret. Okay, so we get, you'd almost miss it, but it really helps enforce or reinforce the groove that Mike's kind of putting across. So, and then we have this kind of separation between the lower and the upper part of the chords. So once we've gone, we're going to play the single note on the 3rd fret of the low E before we go back to the chord at the 2nd fret. That, and then for the last chord, we're again going to separate the lowest string from the upper part of the chord. So we play the 3rd fret of the low E, and then the upper part of it. I'm going to do it really, really slowly so that you can hear where all these little bits are. So here we go. Okay, and that's the last bit. We kind of roll off almost to nowhere from the 3rd fret. Again, I'll do it one more time, slowly. Okay, if you listen really carefully on Tales from the Bulge, that's kind of what's going on. And for that first part of the riff, that kind of happens every time. We preempt it with a little dead note. And we get something different happening in that bit. So once we have done, we're actually going to slide up to this chord from the 3rd fret. Like that, so we get, yeah? Starting to sound more like it, how exciting. And then what we do, instead of going straight to our 2nd chord, which remember is that bar at the 5th fret with the 7th fret of the D and the G, we intersperse another open string on the low E. So we get, and then we repeat, the only difference being that we slide from the 5th fret the 2nd time around rather than the 3rd. And just like before, we're going to slide off that chord at the 5th fret. So just a 2nd time. Okay, there we go. So let's put those two parts together slowly, and then I'll bring it up to tempo for you. So that wasn't slow, sorry. Okay, and it's tempo. I remember hearing this track the first time. I remember the riff started and I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. It's a pretty great guitar sound, drums sound cool. And then that part came in and I was just like sold on Michael Landau from there onwards really. So what's going on? I'm gonna show you the chords, and then I want to talk about actually how to sort of name these and identify what's going on, because that's what makes it repeatable and applicable within your own kind of playing. So this really cool kind of descending pattern, it's actually really simple to play. It's only 2 shapes, and I've seen Mike play this like a few ways, because what he tends to do these days is he sort of comps the 2 guitar parts into one and uses these like big voicings over like sort of 5 strings or something. That's how he's been playing it live for a long time, and it sounds great. To my ear, there is more separation on the Tales from the Bulge record, and there's kind of like one part doing these sort of 3-note high voicings, and then the other part doing these lower 3 strings, which is like the dirty guitar sound. So I'm going to show you the higher part. The first shape we have is this one, which is little finger on the 10th fret of the D, index finger on the 7th fret of the G, and middle finger on the 8th fret of the B string. So that's the first chord, but it's also shape number 1. We're going to be reusing that. So make sure you get your kind of muscle memory around it. A good thing to do when you learn a new shape is to fret it, take your hand off. Fret it, take your hand off, fret it, take your hand off, shake it out. This is kind of what I'll do with students sometimes when they're getting their hands around like a new one. And when you are fretting a shape like this, what you're trying to do is get each finger landing on the right fret at the same time. So try not to do chord building where you place one at a time. Try and get them all moving in synchronization. Again, shake your hand out, place it, and you'll get into your muscle memory much quicker. So that's shape number 1. Okay, the second shape we have is this, which is just a bar with your index finger across the 7th fret of the D, the G and the B. Okay, what we're now going to do is move this assembly around. So our next part of the sequence, we take the first shape and we build it from the 7th fret. So we have 7th fret, 4th fret and 5th fret of the same strings. So we get, you notice we have that second shape being recycled, this time at the 5th fret. And then we finish up with shape number 1 at the 5th fret of the D. That's your starting point. But what's actually going on here? Let's talk about naming conventions with chords, because this is something that really used to confuse me. I'm not saying that I'm right in this, but this is how I think about things. So in my mind, bass is what contextualizes everything. So if you listen to a track, what the bass guitar or whatever happens to be the lowest kind of frequency instrument sort of determines how our ear contextualizes everything above it. Okay? If you think about it, if you are playing, let's say, part of a C chord, merrily playing what you think is C major, and your bass player goes, no, bugger that, I'm going to play an A. Does it sound like C major anymore? No, because the root note has recontextualized the upper part of that chord relative to itself. So now it's actually an A minor 7. Okay, and that's kind of how I think about naming chords. So with this sequence, what I was doing really was listening to what's happening in the bass and listening to what is happening within the lower guitar part, and then looking at these notes relative to that. So to give you like an example, if we take the very first chord in this, the root note in the bass at that time is this, which it's at the 7th fret of the low E, but you've got to remember we're in drop D, so it's actually an A. And what I would do is look at all of these notes in relation to the A, and you might say, what do you mean? The way to think about intervals is always to relate back to the major scale. And that doesn't mean that you're always thinking about the key the song is in or anything like that. You are thinking about the major scale that is tied to whatever the note or the root note that is happening at the time. That's how we think about intervals. So in this case, the bass guitar and the rhythm guitar are playing this A note. So what I'm going to do is think about the 7 notes that fit within the A major scale, and I'm going to compare that to the notes that I have in this Landau chord. Okay, and if I do that, what I get is this. I go, okay, well, we have the root note in the bass. What is this note? And I would go, okay, well in my scale I'd have A, which would be root, B, which would be the major second, and within the scale I would have C sharp being the major third, but that's not the note we have there. We actually have a C. Okay, which means that that interval is a flat third. We're comparing it to the root note of A, and we're going within the scale of A, that note is the third degree that's been flattened, so it's a minor third essentially. And I'll go through each note doing the same thing. So I'd go, okay, well, what about this note here? What is that? And I'd go through the same process. How does that note relate to the root note of A? And I would go through my scale, and what you'd find is that it is the flat 7, or the minor 7th. It's the 7th note of the major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which has been lowered by a half step. So what do we have so far? We have a root, we have a minor third, and we have a minor 7, which, if you know your chord types, that's implying a minor 7 chord. It just doesn't have a 5th in it. So what's our extra note? Well, this one, again, same process. Think about how that fits into the A major scale. It would be the 4th note. So we could call it a 4 within the context of a chord. But the other way that we could name it would be an 11. And I'm not going to get too deep into this now, but why would I call it an 11 and not a third? Well, Western music theory is what's called a tertiary system. Already you're going, oh my God, switch off. But it just means that basically everything is built in thirds. So if we have a scale, it means that to make chords, we're taking the first note, we're skipping the second, we're taking the third. We're skipping the fourth, we're taking the fifth. So we're stacking intervals of thirds on top of each other, and that's where the chords come from. Now, by that logic, it means that to make a chord, we get the root, we get the third, we get the fifth, we get the 7th, because we're skipping an interval in between every time. But you can actually keep going. If you play the same 7 notes into a second octave, no new notes, just second octave of the same scale, you rename the intervals. So after you get to 1, 3, 5, 7, the next interval you come to would be a 9, okay? And a 9 is the same as a second. And if you keep going, you get an 11, which is the same as a 4, and a 13, which is the same as a 6th. So when you see these big scary chord names like major 13, sharp 11, you just have to remember that 13 is just another word for 6, 11 is just another word for 4, and 9 is just another word for 2. So it's the same 7 notes of the major scale that we use all the time. So what that would give us within this chord would be a root, a minor third, an 11th, and a flat 7. So I would call this a minor 7, add 11, no 5, meaning no 5th. Okay. It sounds, I know that sounds so complicated for what it is, but it just helps you to understand why it sounds the way it does, because you go, okay, well, all of that's pretty standard fare apart from the fact that we have a third, a minor third, and a 4th within the same chord, which is creating that kind of Landau-y sound, and that's how you start to dissect what's going on. Okay, let's get into this sort of main, I guess we're going to call it like a verse riff. Some great chords in it, but it all centers around this little hammered motif at the start. So for this, to me it sounds like Mike is using fingers, personally. And if you see him play it live, he's using fingers as well, so I'm going to make that assumption. We start with the open D, and we hammer on to the major third, which is F sharp, with your third finger. We pick both the open G and the second fret of the G. And then we're going to fret the root note an octave up with our middle finger, third fret of the B. And then we play the open E on top of that. So again, what we're getting is an add 9 sound, because again, we're looking at the root note of D. That's just a D triad, the root, the 5th, sorry, beg your pardon, the 3rd, the 5th, and the root. And then we have an open E on top. E is the 2nd note of the D scale. Why do we call it a 9 and not a 2nd? Because we already have a 3rd in it. So we make the assumption that it has been generated in the 2nd octave of the scale. For those of you who are like getting a bit lost with this, please don't worry. It might be helpful. I have a video on why intervals are important, like from a little while back. It may be worth having a glance at that. But I'm going to go into more detail on the theory side of stuff in subsequent videos. So don't panic if you feel like this is going over your head a little bit. Go back and look at those videos as like a little intro to it, and maybe then revisit these, and they should make a little bit more sense. Now, what great sounding chords. What's going on here? Well, all of this is against the root note of D. And what we have is just a D triad, which is going to be the 7th fret of the G and the B and the 5th fret of the E, which is literally just root, 3rd, 5th. And then what Mike does is he keeps his index finger at the 5th fret and then stretches up to the 9th fret of the G and the B. So you get... And what that does is we go from root, 3rd, 5th to 2nd, sharp 4, 5th, which just sounds awesome. Once he's done this, he just moves the whole assembly down 2 frets, which starts at the, basically like a C triad, and then opens it out in the same way. But bearing in mind, we're still playing this against a root note of D. So although it looks like a C, we have to think about the context of it, and again we'd look at it the same way. We'd go, how does this fit into the scale of D? Or we have a flat 7, we have a 2nd, and we have a 4. Okay, so to piece that together, we're seeing the re-emergence of those shapes from earlier. So for the 2nd time sort of bar, we just have the bar at the 7th fret of the D, G and B, and then our spread shape, 7th fret of the D, 4th fret of the G, 5th fret of the B, and then move that assembly down a tone. So put them both together and we get... Now, Mike occasionally adds a couple of little variations, like sliding into it as a 6th, which is just basically missing out the G string and just playing the 7th fret of the D and the B. But ultimately, it's the same kind of idea throughout. You can listen out for those variations, and occasionally he just goes... and misses out the sort of little C triad altogether, but it's quite simple and it's quite kind of repetitive. Okay, so the little kind of bit that links this is really simple. It's actually with a gainier sound, but it's all over there. I'm pretty lazy. So basically all we do is take a D power chord in open position. So I'm sort of raking with my fingers the open low D, the regular D string, the 2nd fret of the G and the 3rd fret of the B. And then all he does is sort of bounce between bending the notes on the G and the B and then opening up the G string like that, so we get this tries to do the Canadian wobble, Daniel Lanois thing, failed. So let's talk about this sort of really interesting bit at the B section. So what I'm not going to do, I don't think, is break down intervallantly what's happening with every single chord. What I'd like you to do is have a go at doing it yourself now that you're kind of armed with a method for doing it. Listen to what the bass is doing. For most of it, it's just holding an open D and then it moves towards the end of the progression. So look at how these notes relate to that root. In that case, it'd be like a flat 7, a minor 3rd, and a sharp 4 or a flat 5. So we get. If you can do that with each chord, it'll give you an idea about how to name it and intervallantly speaking what's going on. But let's just break it down from a playing perspective for now. So what I do is start with my ring finger on the 5th fret of the G string and little finger on the same fret of the B, and play those two together and then slide the note on the B string up a semitone. At that point I'll place the index finger on the 4th fret of the high E. Now all that happens there is that your ring finger moves up to the 6th fret as well. It was on the 5th, now moves up to the 6th. Okay, and then we go, which is, imagine like a kind of open D shape, but moved up a tone so that it's actually like an E triad. So we get. Which is so cool. And we kind of have this, I guess the idea, we have a lot of kind of chromaticism going on because we're going from C to C sharp to B, but we have that note ringing all the way through all 3 chords, which kind of holds the show together really. Then we see Old Familiar from earlier, that lovely, I mean really it's kind of like a sus2 shape but in a different context, which is little finger on the 10th fret of the D, index finger on the 7th fret of the G, middle finger on the 8th fret of the B. Difference being this time that we are barring the index finger, which gives us access to the 7th fret of the high E as well. And then we have what is essentially like an F major 9, which is a bar at the 3rd fret of the top 4 strings, and then ring finger on the 5th fret of the G, little finger on the 5th fret of the B. So we get, I forgot to mention as well, with those earlier chords you have the open D ringing in throughout all of it. And then on the repeat we have this. Which has a lot of similarities and just a couple of differences. So it starts out the same. Then we have a new chord. In this one we still have the open D. We have index finger on the 3rd fret of the G, little finger on the 5th fret of the B, middle finger on the 3rd fret of the high E. And he does this really cool thing where he plays the chord and then drops the index finger a further half step. index finger on the 5th fret of the D, and then 7th fret of the other strings. I tend to try and use a different finger for every interval where possible, but you could bar it if you wanted to. I know Mike does sometimes. And then our final chord, we basically have our middle finger on the 3rd fret of the D, index finger on the 2nd fret of the G, and then the top 2 strings at the 3rd fret. And how they're played is G and B together, E by itself, and then whole chord, but without the A string in there. Okay, I'm going to piece that together for you slowly. Hopefully you've been able to extract like a few things from this. The lessons that I'd like you to take away from it are, one, sort of just being as detail conscious as possible when you are listening to stuff critically to try and figure it out. The other thing is that I hope that you have some idea now how to kind of work out what is happening from an intervallic perspective with complicated looking chords. Just remember that you've just got to identify what the root note is at the time, and then look at how the notes fit within or outside of that particular major scale. I used to get so confused with intervals when I was at college because I was like, do I relate everything to the key that the song is in? Because that can get really messy, especially when stuff gets sort of non-diatonic. But no, it's just contextualize it based on what is happening at that time, because that's the same way your ear contextualizes it. The last thing is that hopefully it's kind of given you access to just like a few fun voicings to play with and maybe take forward into your own playing. I think that sequence is so interesting and so creative, and offers some kind of quite challenging tonalities, but in a really, really cool way. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. I will see you guys soon. I have more videos on the way. I'm approaching, hopefully having a little bit more free time as sort of the uni that I teach at calms down a little bit and goes into summer, and I'm hoping to get into like a weekly schedule. If not now, then very soon. So I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Have a great weekend.